The Quarry was developed by Supermassive and published by 2K. This marks yet another horror game from Supermassive within the interactive drama genre. Now that there's several games in, it bewilders me that Supermassive has plenty of experience with making these games, yet they haven't made one that matches the quality of 2015's Until Dawn, which by the way just got the green light for a film adaptation. Looking back at Until Dawn, it was a massive hit with both critics and consumers, and the reasons for it are clear as day. The game had a substantial budget with bolstering production values. It was properly paced with none of the chapters dragging out the story. The characters were dynamic and the threat was properly introduced. The action sequences were enthralling and they were non-linear. The Quarry, by comparison, simply doesn't live up to Until Dawn's legacy, despite its robust effort. There's a few things that went wrong with this that drags down the quality. First and foremost, this game has fantastic production value similar to Until Dawn, but with it being a newer game, everything looks better. The problem in a few areas would be the way they animate the actors' facial expressions. Quite often, the facial expressions on the characters look off, and I'm not sure that it's a result of shoddy motion capture or poor animation. Either way, it's jarring at times when you're in the middle of an important scene and the characters react in ways that break the immersion of the game. It's a constant problem with a character like Emma, whose mouth seems to have a mind of its own, versus a character like Abigail, who appears to be perfectly animated and looks spot on with the real person. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. An even more egregious fault that this game has is the pacing. The Quarry has some severe pacing issues right from the beginning. Chapters 1 and 2 are severely slow, and they don't introduce a wide array of important information regarding the characters or the setup of the plot. Quite a bit could have been cut out to condense down the story and make it a tighter experience, which would have suited this game even more on subsequent playthroughs. This is a consistent issue throughout the game, but it's most certainly noticeable at the beginning. It does help that the characters are dynamic, although some seem to just be unlikable no matter what path you choose for them to go in, or what you determine their dialogue to be. A character like Jacob indefinitely fits this description, as he's written to be a soft, sensitive, unlikable jackass regardless of what path the player guides him in. Another strange design choice that became more noticeable during my playthrough is the claustrophobic camera. The camera placement is way too close up on the character you're controlling, and even during tight spaces such as when a character is walking up a flight of stairs, the camera will zoom in on the back of their head to the point where they're barely visible on screen. This was a horrible design choice, and why something like this exists in a game whose perspective is in the third person is beyond basic comprehension. Combine this with the annoying widescreen black bars on screen, one at the top and the other at the bottom, that can't be turned off in the settings, and you have a very jarring game to look at during critical points where the game is actually encouraging the player to explore their environment. It may be a movie in video game form, but that doesn't mean that it should have the same aspect ratio of a movie. It's still a video game. Speaking of which, another problem that seems to be a consistent issue with games of this type is the level of player interaction. There are too many moments where the most interaction you have is simply walking around trying to find something of relevance to interact with, and not all of the objects you can interact with is relevant to anything, be it the gameplay or the story. This is a problem with interactive dramas in general, is that they seem to struggle with wanting to be too much like the movies they're emulating, but fail to give enough interaction to the player to keep them engaged. At one point, I started to doze off during a chapter because I was just not getting the level of interaction I wanted out of this. The game's rather inconsistent pacing made it worse. The only thing that saved this game, really, was the story. Strangely enough, though, early on, I had started to piece together similarities with the plot of this game and the plot of Until Dawn, only to realize that they're virtually the same game. The major difference is that the Quarry's threat involves werewolves, while Until Dawn's threat involved Wendigos. But even their design looks similar, as if they're distant cousins. It's almost as if Supermassive tried to replicate Until Dawn's success. And if that was the case, then as far as I'm concerned, they failed. Regarding replayability, Interactive dramas have struggled with this immensely because many of the achievements in these games require the player to replay large portions of the game or the entire plot to achieve specific events and obtain a different or even all endings. And since there's no chapter select for most of these things, it becomes a situation where you're dumping dozens upon dozens of hours into a game that ultimately has slower pacing than most other genres simply due to the nature of what these games are. The Quarry alleviates this somewhat thanks to a chapter select option in the main menu upon completion, but it can only be accessed one time, forcing the player to play the rest of the game from the chapter they choose to jump in before chapter select is available again. The game also gives the player the option to rewind a character's death up to 3 times, allowing the player multiple chances to save a character's life. It's a minor improvement that I welcome, but it doesn't go far enough to solve the problem of being forced to replay entire chapters. A true solution would be for the player to have access to a robust chapter select option that's divided into smaller segments, so the player doesn't have to replay large portions of the game that they find to be slow or boring. And what's with these games having all of these collectibles? They got these tarot cards in the game, and you don't know where they are. The game doesn't hand out hints of their location, and the camera will just randomly zoom out when you walk near them, but they're never placed where the characters can actually go in the level. It's strange. Collectibles in video games in general is a very outdated concept that just needs to either die off or be strictly reevaluated as to their importance, but interactive dramas and collectibles simply just don't mix. They try to throw in hints to let the player know what's coming up in the story, and they're just not helpful since the hints don't really tell the player anything of importance. They're ultimately a waste of time. Currently, there's more interactive dramas pending release. Supermassive specifically is making a sci-fi horror game that's a part of the Dark Pictures anthology. There's still Quantic Dream's Star Wars Eclipse that's scheduled for release at some point as well. So I welcome more games of this genre within the market, but they're going to have to really start doing more to engage the player, and they're going to have to make smarter choices when it comes to the design of these games. The pacing needs to improve exponentially, and different types of stories need to be explored. Supermassive is keen on making more horror games within this genre, but maybe they should try their hand at an interactive drama that's set in the action genre or the sci-fi genre. Do something that moves away from the horror genre, something that moves away from their comfort zone, would probably be in their best interest.